Okay, Dr. Alicia, she qualified as a vet in 2011, and she initially worked in a small animal private practice for 2 years. In 2014, she joined the Directorate Animal Health of the National Department of Agriculture as a state veterinarian, and she's employed in the Disease Control Sub-Directorate, and she's mainly involved in policy development with a focus on zoonotic diseases and liaison with the Department on Health regarding zoonotic disease outbreaks, and also guidance on disease control strategies and adherence to the Animal Disease Act. And lastly, the evaluation of research applications under Section 20 of the Act. She will give us a presentation on brucellosis. Have we lost the battle? Dr. Alicia, thank you, and we're looking forward to your presentation. So you can start sharing.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Can you see the presentation?
I can see the presentation. Thank you.
Just started on slideshow mode. There we go.
I'm just going to mute everybody, and if I mute you, please just unmute yourself. I just want to erase this. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I'll put my video on afterwards for if there are any questions as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Apologies, I think I was just in a wrong meeting room. Sorry for making you wait. So today we'll be discussing a very important disease when it comes to dairy farming, and that's brucellosis, and also eventually trying to answer the question, have we lost the battle? Okay, so firstly, what we'll do is we're going to cover some background on the disease. We'll discuss the complexity of brucellosis, why it's important, and we'll also look at the current legislation and control measures. And then we can see if we can attempt to answer that question, have we lost the battle against this disease? Okay, so firstly, when it comes to dairy farming, it's basically a passion and a business as well, and it contributes largely to food safety and security. Keeping in mind that your production of milk needs to be ethical, it needs to be economically viable, and it also needs to be safe for your consumers. So you do require active inputs to manage and prevent different risks, and these include disease risks as well. So in terms of especially diseases, you need prevention and management plans to try and prevent outbreaks from occurring instead of having to deal with them afterwards, which often costs you a lot more money and inputs. And when it comes to disease management, obviously this will include your brucellosis prevention and management plan. Okay, so bovine brucellosis is caused by the bacteria Brucella abortus. It's an intracellular bacteria, making it basically impossible to treat, and it also leads to chronic and debilitating disease. The main symptom that we see in cattle is abortion, and this typically happens in the last trimester, but you can also see the birth of weak calves, retained placentas, your bulls may become infertile, your intercalving period becomes longer, and you can also see hygromids in animals that have chronic disease. The organism may also be shed in the milk, and that's obviously a problem when it comes to rearing your calves, and then also for humans that consume milk if it's not boiled or pasteurized. And there's no treatment available in cattle. It's just because it's such a fastidious intracellular organism, it requires many months of antibiotic treatment, and you're also often not successful in eliminating the organism. That's why we don't treat cattle for this disease. Okay, so the way that your cows or your cattle are mainly infected are through sniffing and licking of aborted fetuses, placenta, any birth materials or birth fluids, or a newly born calf. And your cattle are typically curious creatures that do this. The bacteria then come in contact with your mucous membranes of your mouth, eyes, or the nose, and that's how it enters into the body. You can also get infected via drinking infected milk. So if you have calves that are suckling on infected cows that are actively shedding into the milk, the disease can be transmitted that way. And then also when grazing on contaminated pasture or when drinking contaminated water, and this would typically be if a cow calved or aborted on pasture or close to a water source. You can also then get your intrauterine infection of the fetus. Obviously, if there's contact with other infected cows from the neighbors, you can get disease transmission. And your bulls can become sterile if they become infected with brucellosis or if you vaccinate them. So once again, just a reminder, we don't vaccinate bulls because they can become infertile. So during the birth process, this is sort of the key way in which brucellosis is typically spread. The birth process, or if there's an abortion, releases millions upon millions of Brucella bacteria into the environment. This is how your environment becomes contaminated and how your cattle eventually becomes infected with the disease. So we regard this as the main mode of transmission. Brucellosis, as you know as well, is also a zoonosis. So basically your veterinarian, farmer, family members, workers, anyone that's in contact with the animals are at risk of contracting the disease if it's present in the cattle population. So transmission to humans is mainly through drinking raw milk from infected cows, but also if you're handling placenta, birth fluids, or abortions from infected cows, you can become infected. Also, if you're not careful with vaccination and you accidentally get a needle stick injury or get some of it into your eye, you can get the disease. And then also through slaughter, and especially informal slaughter. If this is not done properly or with appropriate PPE, you can also pick up the disease. Your symptoms in humans, unfortunately, is non-specific, so it's difficult to know what you have. You get flu-like symptoms, typically a recurrent fever. It can also affect reproductive organs of humans or any other organ system, depending where it's localized. It causes tiredness, can cause depression, and it can also, unfortunately, become a chronic form of disease that's also nearly impossible to get rid of. Treatment is available for humans. It also consists of a long antibiotic course. And here it's very important, as soon as you think you've been exposed, to get yourself tested. If you're positive, to start treatment as soon as possible to try and eradicate the bacteria, to try and prevent this chronic form of the disease. We need to keep in mind as well with brucellosis that it is a herd disease, which just basically means when you have infected cattle, let's say you've got a 100-head cattle herd, and only about 10 out of the 100 test positive, you still quarantine that whole herd because the rest of the in-contact cattle may potentially still be incubating the disease. So you need to regard that whole herd as potentially infected if you've picked up a few positive individuals. This is because brucellosis has got a short to even a very long incubation period, and it's very important then to continuously test the rest of the herd to see if any additional positive animals can be picked up. Problem with brucellosis as well is that cattle may look very healthy. You don't always see the typical abortion storms in infected herds, and especially if the herd has become infected and it's been chronically infected for many, many years, you don't often see these abortion storms. So it's very difficult to pick up this disease just by looking at individual cows or just by looking at a herd in general. This just once again highlights the importance of testing your entire herd to determine the brucellosis status and not relying on individual animal tests alone. Okay, so when it comes to testing for brucellosis, when you have herds that are negative or if you do not know the status of them, initially you collect blood so that you can do serum tests, and you do this 2 months apart. So the serological test that we use is firstly the RBT screening test, which is a very sensitive test. And then the individuals that tested positive on the RBT, you then continue to test them with the CFT test as your confirmatory serological test. You then also get your milk ring tests that you can do monthly on your bulk tank samples. And then, of course, you've got your culture, where you can culture milk samples, organ samples, or if you've got aborted fetus samples or placenta. And that's basically your gold standard in identifying the organism. Once again, yeah, interpretation is only done on a herd basis and not just by looking at individual animals. You'll first determine the status of the herd of a whole, if it's positive or negative or suspect, and then you can look at the individual animal results to determine if the individuals are positive, negative, or suspect. Okay, so yeah, I'm just giving a triangle of what brucellosis typically looks like on a disease. Oh, sorry, what brucellosis typically looks like in a herd. So when you look at your test results and then animals that actually test positive on your test, you'll see that it's just a small proportion of the triangle, so literally the tip of the iceberg, your animals that are positive on the test results. And then if you look at a bit larger portion of the triangle, this is actually the infected animals. So these are the animals that are still incubating the disease. They're currently false negative on tests and eventually they'll become positive. So you've actually got a bigger proportion that you think that could be potentially positive. And then the lower part of the triangle is your animals that are negative on tests and that are actually uninfected. And then also at the bottom right corner here, you'll always get a small percentage that are not really infected, but they could have a false positive test result as well. So that also highlights the importance of repeated testing of your herd. Okay, so why should dairy farmers actually care about brucellosis? Unfortunately, in the country, there is a high risk of acquiring brucellosis, and that's due to current low vaccination rates, low testing rates, and unfortunately, we do not have a movement control system currently for cattle in the country. So what is at risk here? It's basically the health and the production of our cattle herds, the health of farmers, the workers involved, and your veterinary professionals, and then your farming operation as a whole in terms of the growth of the business and your profit as well. Yeah, I'm just showing you a map of the reported bovine brucellosis outbreaks for the last 5 years. And you can basically see, if you look at the distribution of cases, pretty much where we farm with cattle in the country, we have brucellosis. Also keeping in mind that this map is an underrepresentation of what is truly going on, because firstly, these dots represent herds that were tested. They were effectively reported to the responsible state veterinarian, and the responsible state veterinarian effectively reported it to the national office so that we could record it. So obviously you'll have many more infected herds that might just not have been picked up yet. Okay, so just in terms of numbers, in the last 5 years, we basically had just over 1,000 new outbreaks that were reported with regards to Brucella abortus, and that would be mainly in cattle, but then also a few outbreaks in buffalo and wildlife. I'm just showing you a bit of a newer map. This is for January to December 2020. If you look at the red dots, your distribution is basically still the same. It's just fewer dots. You were also just keeping in mind in 2020, there were obviously some challenges with regards to COVID and the COVID restrictions. So you would have had much less herds tested and obviously reported through veterinary services as well. Okay, so your typical risk points in terms of acquiring brucellosis is farmers often buy infected cattle without knowing or asking what the brucellosis status of the cattle are. And this leads us to the question, how good is the awareness that we're currently conducting? Because that should be one of the first things that farmers need to keep in mind, is to ask, what is the disease status of the cattle? Especially if you look at that map, you are pretty much at risk of potentially buying in brucellosis if you don't ask these type of questions and ask for proof of negative testing. What farmers also sometimes do is they just test individual animals that they would like to sell, and then they only sell those individuals that are negative on the test. So they don't necessarily conduct herd tests. You don't know the true status of the animals. You don't know if they maybe originate from a positive herd and they just currently test negative. So you could be buying cattle that are still incubating the disease. So that's a danger with testing individual animals only and not relying on herd tests. Here we need to keep in mind once again that your initial test, if you're doing a herd test, needs to be conducted twice, 2 months apart on the whole herd so that you can determine the herd status. Auctions could also potentially be a risk, and here we need to ask the question, do we need to put more emphasis on vendor declarations so that farmers declare if there is not only for brucellosis but other diseases if it's present on the farm. We need to look at speculators as well. These activities are often very, very high risk, just because they don't necessarily care about the disease status of the animals. It's mainly about profit and quickly selling animals. You need to also consider your neighboring farms. Also, the shared grazing, if you're maybe renting out some of your pastures or if you're utilizing someone else's pastures who's also got cattle, you need to be of a potential risk there. So basically, it all comes down to your biosecurity, knowing what you're bringing into your farm and knowing what you're exposing your animals to. Okay, so specifically in a dairy, brucellosis is an extremely important disease just because you've got a very intensive system. And if you get introduction of the disease, your infection pressure would be really, really high. There's also close contact of animals in a dairy, especially in the camps and when they get into the milking parlor. And you can potentially get contamination of these camps and also of the milking parlor if cattle give birth, their vaginal discharges, and obviously as they release some milk as well. Then also looking at things in the milking parlor like your udder cloths, making sure that you don't have shed cloths, and then also your proper disinfection of your milking cluster and all the equipment that you use on the cattle. Then also your cattle have got frequent contact with the workers, so also making your workers aware of how to deal with cattle in terms of biosecurity measures, making sure that disease is not spread from one to the other. Also very important training and awareness that needs to be done. Okay, so when it comes to the economics of brucellosis, it once again shows how important it is in the dairy. If you have abortion storms or even just a few abortions, it means less calves and it means that you'll have less replacement heifers. If weak calves are born, that could require extra inputs from the farmer side to get them back to their full strength again. You have to spend money additionally on retained placentas. There could be brucella in your colostrum in your milk, so you might not be able to use that straight for the calf. You would have to discard that. If you get your mastitis due to brucellosis, it will increase your somatic cell count and also just affect the milk that you sell. You can have an increase in your intercalving period, which is really not ideal for your dairy farm economics, and also a decrease in milk production. So brucellosis does have a severe economic impact on a dairy herd. Then additionally, never mind the disease itself, you then have the cost of quarantine measures, meaning that your animals can't be sold off the farm. And then also if you have to slaughter your positive animals, obviously that's a loss to the farmer because then you would need to buy new animals once your herd is clean. It's a long process, it's a tedious process, and one that unfortunately requires a lot of inputs and costs a lot of money. Okay, so the requirements for brucellosis control, it's legislated that all heifers between the ages of 4 to 8 months need to be vaccinated, and we've got S19 or RB51 available that you can vaccinate the heifers with. And then your brucellosis status of your dairy herd needs to be known. That's a requirement from the milk buyer side. So as I've said, you've firstly test your whole eligible herd twice, 2 months apart with serological tests, and if they're negative on both these tests, then a CA3 or a BR3 is issued by the state veterinarian. Then you can go over to monthly milk ring test on the bulk tank, but you at least still need to repeat the herd serology at a minimum every second year, or if you pick up any suspect milk ring test results, just to make sure that your herd is still negative. Yeah, I just want to remind you that we're talking a lot about brucellosis today, but please don't forget about tuberculosis. This is also a zoonotic disease and can also be spread through the milk. It's also a chronic and erosive disease, and once you have it in your herd, also quite difficult to get rid of it, and also requires a whole testing and slaughter protocol. And yeah, like I said, also a zoonosis that can be spread through the milk. So you sort of go through a similar process with TB, where you have to test your herd twice. That would be 3 months apart. Then you get a TB3 declaration that's also required to sell milk. And these herds you then retest every 2 years with your intradermal tuberculin test, or if there's any disease suspicion. So usually you'll test for brucellosis and tuberculosis sort of at the same time, so that you can do a declaration for both these diseases. Okay, coming back to brucellosis, and in terms of the current legislation, brucellosis is a controlled disease. In terms of the Animal Diseases Act, tuberculosis is as well. And then the Animal Diseases Regulation, Table 2, describes the control measures as well for brucellosis. And in there it states the compulsory vaccination of heifer calves between 4 to 8 months old. Then we've also got the bovine brucellosis scheme. At this point, it's still a voluntary scheme. It aims for control and eradication of the disease. But as soon as a herd is tested and found infected, it's then compulsory to keep on testing this herd, and then it falls under government control so that the disease can be controlled and eradicated off the farm. We then also have an interim manual for brucellosis in cattle that we last edited in 2016. And this has got a lot more detail on the disease itself, the different diagnostics, the epidemiology, and also the control measures. And I just gave you the link here as well that you can follow to download this manual. It is very useful, especially when it comes to the control measures and how to deal with an infected herd. Okay, so when a herd is infected, obviously your property will be quarantined. So no animals may move onto the property or off of the property. They may only move off of the property if they're going to be slaughtered, and this would be done under Red Cross permit from the responsible state veterinarian. The cattle are then tested every 6 to 8 weeks to see if you can pick up any additional positive cattle. And obviously, the sooner that you can remove positive cattle out of the herd, the better, because then you're removing a source of infection to the rest of the cattle. So the property is quarantined mainly to protect other farmers as well. It's not nice and it's not pleasant for the farmer that's being quarantined. But the whole point is to prevent animals from moving to other farms or into other herds, thereby spreading the infection further and making it a big problem across other herds as well. Okay, so your infected cattle also need to be C-branded. So all your animals that test positive on your serological tests are C-branded on the right-hand side of the neck, as you can see in this picture. So the reason why this is done is once again to protect other farmers. So if you ever see a C-branded cow at an auction or being sold through a speculator, people should know what the C brand means so that they don't buy in these animals. So also, once again, awareness is really, really important, because if people don't know what this brand means, they might still buy the animal. So very important to create awareness. This is also important to brand the animals for if they're eventually sent to the abattoir for slaughter, that the workers definitely know what they're dealing with. Okay, so in your infected herds, you also aim to keep your positive cattle separate from the animals that are still testing negative. And extremely important is do not allow cows that are positive to calve on your farm, as this once again releases millions of bacteria. You get environmental contamination, and this is the main source of exposure for other animals. Sometimes if you have, let's say, a heavily pregnant cow and you can't send her for slaughter straight away, do your best to try and isolate her, preferably, let's say, in a camp or a pen where there's some cement that can be cleaned easily. Just once again, trying to prevent bacteria from contaminating the rest of the farm environment. Okay, so once again, you remove your positive cattle through slaughter. Otherwise, they'll just be spreading the infection to the rest of your herd. And it's also important to advise slaughter of heifers that are born from infected cows. If you don't do this, you can typically see your 2-year breakdown syndrome, or you call these heifers your Trojan heifers. This is when you get an intrauterine transmission of brucellosis to the heifer calf. They typically keep on testing negative on serological tests until they themselves become pregnant and calf down. Then they tend to seroconvert. Then it's already basically too late because they would have already started spreading the infection. So this is, if someone is really keen on getting rid of the disease as soon as possible, we do advise slaughtering these heifers born from positive cows so that you don't sit with potential problems later down the line, and then you have to start your disease control program from the start again. Okay, so eradication of this disease from a herd is a really expensive exercise, and it's really intensive as well and requires a lot of work. So this is once again why prevention is a lot better and a lot cheaper than cure. So with brucellosis, this is something that we really promote, is rather prevent getting the disease than having to deal with it later. Okay, so we said as well that we've got S19 and RB51 available as our vaccine options. So S19 you can only use in heifers between 4 to 8 months of age, whereas RB51 you can use on all non-pregnant cows. So you can vaccinate your older cows as well, and you can also use this as a booster vaccine. It's just because S19, if you vaccinate heifers that are older than 8 months, they can have persistent antibody titers. So then if you test them later on in life, you'll pick them up as positive serological reactors, but then it's just due to late vaccination. So that's also why it's important if you initially test your herds to test them twice 2 months apart so that you can look at the rise and fall of titers to determine if you're not maybe sitting with a herd that's just been vaccinated late. And then just again with S19 and RB51, both of these are live vaccines. So be really careful when you use these vaccines and beware of self-vaccination, and also inform your farmers if they're using the vaccines just to be careful as well. And if there was a needle stick injury or an exposure for yourself or for farmers, be advised to rather seek medical attention and just take the package insert with so that the doctor knows, what tests to request. Just because with RB51, you won't pick it up on typical serological tests that they do for humans. They would need to do additional testing. So just keep that in mind when you're using RB51 as well. Okay, then when we come to Section 11 of the Animal Diseases Act, I just thought I would highlight this as well because it just shows you where the responsibility of disease control lies when it comes to animal diseases, not just for brucellosis and controlled diseases, but for all animal diseases. So basically, this section of the Act states that it's a responsibility of the owner of the animals to prevent disease in their herds, to treat any disease that's present, and also to prevent the spread to other animals and to other herds. So government veterinary services, private veterinary services, your cattle farmers, industry, all of us are part of the brucellosis prevention and control. It's not just government or not just veterinarians that's responsible for this. The owners need to play their part. Industry needs to play their part. We all need to work together if we want to control this disease. So very important in terms of farmers and what they can do to protect themselves. Firstly is to know the brucellosis status of their herd, and to do that they need to test regularly. Then also to vaccinate the heifers to help protect their own herd, and then only to buy in cattle from negative herds. So where there was proof of a herd test that was conducted or 2 of them that were negative. Then also in terms of biosecurity, make sure that you've got sufficient biosecurity in place, because basically you are protecting your assets and your cows. And then also just be aware that this is a zoonosis that can potentially spread to people working with the animals, or that are drinking unpasteurized milk or consuming unpasteurized dairy products. Okay, so just a quick look at the history of brucellosis control in South Africa. So a control and eradication program was established in 1969, which was also based on the test and slaughter principle. And the occurrence of brucellosis was actually very low in the mid to late 1980s. And this was even before the brucellosis scheme was published. It was published in 1988. So they actually very effectively tested and slaughtered positive cattle. And these initial schemes seem to achieve very good control. At that point in time, government funding was available, manpower as well, and it was prioritized at a national level for the control of this disease. There was also at that point in time good general compliance of livestock owners with the regulatory requirements, and this obviously made it a lot easier to go out vaccinating and testing herds and slaughtering infected cattle. But since then, the responsibility of your continued testing and vaccination was handed over to livestock owners in the late 1980s, and that was more or less at the point when the scheme was published. It's just because it became a very expensive exercise to obviously cover all these herds, and the owner's responsibility was brought into the equation. And then also in 1996, we got our new constitution, and a provincialized structure was introduced. And this also meant that veterinary services became provincialized, meaning you don't have a national office giving orders in a top-down approach, telling everyone else what to do. You now have your 9 provinces, each one with their own director of veterinary services, each one with their own veterinary services, and everyone needs to work together with a national office. So it just makes it a bit more challenging in terms of having a consistent central approach with regards to disease control. So we saw a gradual increase in the occurrence of the disease, and this is mainly due to non-compliance with the prescribed control measures. Okay, so now we can actually come to the question, have we lost the battle? Okay, so brucellosis prevention and control is basically a shared responsibility, as Section 11 of the Act says, between your farmer and then also your veterinary services to provide guidance and assistance. So your farmer needs to take responsibility by vaccinating heifers as required by law, to test the herd as required, and to deal with reactors hopefully quickly and decisively if it's possible. And then only to buy in animals from brucellosis negative herds to protect your herd. And then keeping in mind that good fences do make good neighbors when it comes to disease control. So know your neighbors, know what animals they farm with, ideally what their disease status is as well, so that you know what your risk is. Also important, if possible, not to share grazing or to let your cattle graze on other pasture where potentially infected cattle could be grazing or roaming. And don't try not to mix your cattle with other cattle, especially if they do not have a known brucellosis status. And then be careful of showgrounds as well, as this is also a mixing of animals from many different sources. And this is also a point where disease could be picked up. Okay, so the remaining problems, so the first ones that I mentioned are basically measures that a farmer can take to protect themselves and to protect their herd. So there's a lot that the farmer can do to protect themselves against this disease. The remaining problems with brucellosis do require collective responsibility and control. Okay, so this is obviously why it's a controlled disease in terms of the Animal Diseases Act and why veterinary services is involved. Is just because you do still require that collective control. So then also, if you look at your neighboring cattle, whether they're dairy, beef, or communal cattle, they could be, infected with brucellosis as well. We often get situation where fences are being cut or where fences aren't maintained and cattle roam onto other farms, and this is also a mode of disease spread. Cattle are often bought under false declarations and also unverified test results. And you also get cattle that are sold with individual negative test results. And this is really, really dangerous because it could still mean that they originate from a positive herd and that just the individual negative animal was tested and sold and could be harboring the disease. So government veterinary services, your private veterinarians, your stock theft unit at SAPS, your red meat industry, livestock association, your community leaders, all of us need to work together and communicate well in terms to control this disease. Okay, so when we then also look at our veterinary strategy of 2016 to 2026, the OIE, the World Organization of Animal Health, visited South Africa in 2014, and they did a performance of veterinary services gap analysis, basically to have a look at our veterinary services structure, what our capabilities and our resources are, where we're doing a good job and where we can improve as well. And this report then led to the development of the South African veterinary strategy. This strategy basically has got 6 pillars. It covers your veterinary authority in the country, animal health measures, your veterinary public health, feed and food safety, food and veterinary lab diagnostics, your animal and product identification, recording and traceability, so going back to movement control, and then also your animal welfare. I won't go through these tables in detail, but it's just to give you a good idea of what the veterinary strategy entails. I just want to take you to the this middle part of the table, animal health. You'll see there that the brucellosis policy has been tabled there. And it's just through the veterinary strategy, they identified brucellosis as a model disease that they would like to use in the country to improve our disease control in general. So it doesn't mean that brucellosis is necessarily the most important disease in the country, but if we're able to improve our control measures for brucellosis, that means that we will much more easily be able to apply to other diseases as well to improve our approach in general. And that's why it's been chosen as a model disease. Okay, so the bovine brucellosis policy is still under review. The new bovine brucellosis policy document has been published in 2020, and the aim of this document and approach was to set out and clarify, firstly, the broad framework of the disease control strategy that will be followed, to provide guidelines on the roles and responsibilities for the implementation of the policy, and also how are we going to manage this collective control process. Also then keeping in mind that with regards to the control policy, we must ensure that it's implementable, that it's cost effective, and very important that it's sustainable. Brucellosis isn't something that you'll easily just get rid of with a 5-year control program. This will require many decades of control if we would like to properly control the disease in the country and eventually try to eradicate it as well. This is just a picture of the front page of the policy document. And if you're interested in reading a bit further on what the approach will be, I also just gave you the link if you would like to access this document. Okay, so the policy, I'm just quickly going to run through the 7 objectives of the policy. So it obviously focuses on your vaccination, education, and testing. It also focuses on your movement control, slaughter, reporting of cases, and then, of course, the effective implementation of control measures. Because the thing is, currently, we do have really good legislation. The problem is just with the proper implementation of this and making sure that everyone plays their part in controlling this disease. Okay, so we do have a few success stories when it comes to brucellosis. So we've got a brucellosis working group within State Veterinary Services and also a brucellosis steering committee that's been established through industry. And these 2 groups have got a lot of expertise and influence when it comes to controlling the disease and also developing policies and control programs. Various awareness materials have been developed and distributed far and wide over the last 5 to 7 years. So we're really trying to get the word out there to make farmers and veterinarians and anyone who works with animals aware of the potential dangers of this disease. A control diseases week was also introduced to final year vet students. I think that started about 4 years ago. So that's also a fantastic introduction to the course, just because I think it prepares the veterinary students a lot better. As you enter your CCS year, if you're going to be involved with brucellosis and tuberculosis control so that you have good background. So it's great that the vet students are being taught more about the disease. We also have SANAS accreditation and Directorate of Animal Health approval of 7 out of the 9 provincial veterinary labs, and then 4 other private laboratories as well. So we basically just have 2 provinces that still need to become properly accredited and approved to conduct brucellosis testing. There are a lot of local research projects on brucellosis, and this has really increased over the last 5 to 7 years. If you do a search on Google Scholar as well and look for articles from brucellosis in South Africa, let's say from before 2015, you'll only find a handful. If you search for after 2015, you'll see that we're really increasing research in the country on brucellosis. Then we also, through the National Animal Health Forum, there were Provincial Animal Health Forum CPD events where we specifically focused on brucellosis. These events were held in each province in 2017 and also in 2020, also just helping to create more awareness. And then the NICD, our National Institute of Communicable Diseases, they've also started a few human research projects. Unfortunately, due to the current impact that COVID has had, these have been halted, but we're hoping that they can continue again in future. Okay, so in terms of a way forward with regards to brucellosis, like I said, we still do have very good legislation, and the current legislation as is should still be applied. The brucellosis policy that's been published in 2020, the next step would now be the development of your much more detailed implementation plans for each of those 7 objectives. So this means we're busy doing socioeconomic impact assessments, budget determinations, and determining what would be the best way forward to more effectively implement our control measures. So to finally answer the question if we've lost the battle is basically not lost. It is an ongoing battle. And yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, there's a lot that individuals, veterinarians and farmers and even industry can do to protect cattle herds against brucellosis. But it does also require us coming together so that we can apply a much more collective control approach in order to protect each other. So the first thing we obviously need to do is doing what we can with what we have. I've also just provided you with some more links. Sorry, just froze there. Just restart it. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, sorry, it just froze and I accidentally went out of the screen. Okay, just making sure, can you see my slide? Can someone just confirm if you can see the slide?
Okay, now you're still on the same slide. You didn't go into the website, but I can see on your side it's hanging.
Can you see the next two bullets that I forwarded to?
No, it's just the NICD website and the DALRRD website and the NIHF website.
Okay, no, then that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into the websites. I just gave you these links for if you want some more information. From the NICD website, it gives a lot of information on the disease in humans. If you go to the Department of Agriculture website, it obviously gives you your manual of brucellosis in cattle, it gives you the brucellosis policy, and there's also some awareness materials there. And then also a very nice website is the bottom one, the National Animal Health Forum website, where all the awareness materials that we've created for brucellosis you can find there in different languages as well. And there are also some audio clips with regards to brucellosis information available. So if you want anything that you can share with farmers and especially dairy farmers, cattle farmers, take a look at the Animal Health Forum website. There's a lot of information that you can share as well. And then also last year through the SABC, November, December, we had a big campaign on brucellosis. So this was a very nice collaborative effort and a big social media campaign where we just basically shared simple pictures with simple messages across social media to reach as many people as possible. So all of this is still available. So if you didn't see it last year, if any one of you wants access to these materials, you're more than welcome just to send me an email. And I think it's available on the National Animal Health Forum's website as well. Okay, so thanks a lot for your attention. I hope that the presentation helped to shed some light on the importance of brucellosis, especially in the dairy sector. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alicia. We've got some questions here. Ingrid Conradi, she asked, how often should farmers test for brucellosis?
Okay, when it comes to dairy herds, let's say you've never tested that herd before. What you'll do is you'll test the entire eligible herd. So that would be all your cattle 18 months and older. You'll test them twice serologically, 2 months apart. If they're negative on both those tests, at that point, you'll request a BR3 or a CA3 declaration from the state veterinarian. Then if you're just going to continue with serological tests, you'll test them every year for brucellosis, once again, the entire eligible herd. Otherwise, you can also go over to your monthly milk ring test that you do on the bulk tank. But then if you're just going to do the milk ring test, you still, at least every second year, need to still test your herd with serological tests just to make sure that there are no reactors slipping through, because your milk ring test is not, on the bulk tank, is not as sensitive as doing RBTs on individual animals.
Okay, this one also will touch on the previous one. With serological testing that takes place twice, 2 months apart, is a cow diagnosed as being positive, if positive on the first test, to allow the farmer to remove her from the herd as soon as possible, or only diagnosed as being positive after the second test to rule out the risk of false positives and thus culling false positive cows unnecessarily?
Okay, that's a very good question. And yeah, it shows you, we'll see now the benefit of testing twice. So let's create a scenario. The first time that you tested the herd, let's say you got RBT positives, you then tested those individuals on CFT, and let's say they had very low titers. So you just had, let's say, about 5 out of 100 animals with low CFT titers. Then you'll also go back to the farmer and just collect some extra information, checking, what's the biosecurity like? Did they maybe recently introduce any more or new animals? And also, what vaccine do they use? Do they use RB51 or S19 on their heifers? If they use S19, you'll also ask, did you maybe vaccinate some of your heifers that were older than 8 months? So the first thing they would try to establish is, do you maybe have persistent vaccine reactions? If you're still not sure of what's happening there, and it's only a few animals with low titers, I would suggest you just quarantine or keep those animals separate until you do your second test, because you first want to make sure this is really a positive herd before you'll just go ahead and slaughter these animals, especially since your dairy cows are valuable. If you have a situation where on your first test, 40 out of 100 animals are positive, and you've got many high CFT titers, and there's a history that there's been recent purchases, let's say from auctions, and you see this as a high risk situation, and there were multiple animals with very high titers, then you can basically almost be sure that you're dealing with brucellosis. So at that point in time, maybe the farmer would still be in denial and maybe not want to immediately slaughter, but then you have to separate those positive animals from the ones that are currently testing negative, because you don't want some of them, especially if they're pregnant, to calve down or to abort and potentially expose the other test negative animals. But then obviously on your second round of tests, you'll then compare the individual animals as well to see if their serological titers are staying the same, if they're increasing, or if they're dropping. If we go back to the first scenario of just a few cattle with very low CFT titers, if on the second round of test you see those titers are still very low or they're dropping and no additional animals are testing positive, then that sort of points to a situation where it's unlikely to be brucellosis that's actively spreading within the herd. Whereas if you see there are more animals that are test positive on the second round and their titers are climbing, then you know there's disease circulating within the herd. So that's why that second test just gives you confirmation of what's really going on. But sometimes after a first test, you can see I'm sitting with a dangerous situation and I do need to either separate those positive animals or perhaps even just send them straight for slaughter.
Thank you. Will farmers be able to apply for compensation if animals are slaughtered during an outbreak?
At this point in time, or actually throughout the brucellosis control since 1969, there hasn't been compensation for brucellosis because the animals can still be safely slaughtered. If they're slaughtered at an abattoir, they're still safe for human consumption. So the animal is still worth its slaughter value. So that's basically the money that the owner gets back for the animals is its slaughter value. And that's once again a reason why it's so important to protect dairy herds, because obviously these animals to a farmer is worth a lot more than slaughter value. It's not just like a animal that's being feedlotted. So unfortunately at this point they can apply for compensation, but it's not awarded mainly because the animal is still worth its slaughter value.
Thank you. With regards to wildlife on or near cattle farms, can they not act as a reservoir for brucellosis? I've heard that buffalo especially can contract brucellosis and act as spreaders, but are not affected as cattle are by it. Is there any other wildlife species that can act as the disease reservoir, such as wild beasts or even predators feeding on fatal remains or afterbirth?
Okay, also a very good question. Wildlife can definitely act as a reservoir for brucellosis, especially buffalo. Buffalo, correctly said, they can harbor the disease and not show any symptoms, but you can also get cases where buffalo actually abort due to brucellosis. So if you're farming with cattle and your neighboring farms are wildlife farms, that can also be a risk to you. I think when brucellosis was better controlled in the cattle population in South Africa, you had the scenario where your wildlife, especially buffalo, could pose a risk to your cattle. But now, because we're sitting with such a big problem in our cattle population, we're almost sitting with a situation where your cattle are more of a risk to your buffalo, because buffalo at least get tested for foot-and-mouth TB, corridor disease, and brucellosis before they're allowed to be moved. So there's some form of movement control when it comes to buffalo. And we've had a lot of instances as well where buffalo contracted disease potentially from neighboring cattle. So it goes both ways. Cattle are a risk to wildlife, and wildlife are a risk to your cattle as well. So buffalo, definitely one of your big role players, but then there are many other antelope species that have been affected by brucellosis as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a list on the top of my head now, but as far as I know, eland have been affected, kudu have been affected. So many of your large game can be affected, potentially small antelope as well. Keeping in mind as well, also, if you have an extremely high infection pressure, there's a bigger probability of spillover to wildlife species. But then what their active role is in brucellosis, if they'll be able to maintain it within their species, that's a very different question. So they might test positive, but not necessarily be a further spreader of the disease. But there is literature available around that. And there has been research done. So there's a lot of articles out there if you're interested in this field to read up on the wildlife species that have been affected and those that can actively play a role. But buffalo can definitely play an epidemiological role in the spread of brucellosis. Then interesting question as well with regards to your scavengers and your carnivores that consume carcasses of animals infected with brucellosis, let's say a positive buffalo carcass. Technically, they can also get Brucella abortus infection then. There's been cases reported of, okay, this is now coming back to domestic animals, of dogs that have tested positive for Brucella abortus and that have even aborted due to Brucella abortus. But dogs, carnivores, scavengers, they're not typical maintenance hosts for Brucella abortus. So they might become infected and seroconvert and test positive, or they might once off abort, but they're not known as maintenance hosts that will maintain this bacteria within their species and be a persistent problem. They're usually a symptom of a problem in the host species, such as cattle or buffalo. Yeah, so I hope that sheds a bit more light on that situation.
Thank you. Then why are there a difference in control between the provinces? In the Western Cape, herds are certified only on serology test every second year, while in the Eastern Cape, certificates are given on milk ring tests.
It's basically because you do have different options. But basically, if you go and look at the brucellosis manual in cattle, it states there that you can get your BR3 or your CA3 declaration on milk ring tests if you do it monthly. But then, let's say if you get to your second year, you should ideally then test your individual animals again using serological tests just to make sure that you're not missing anything. So the Western Cape places a bit more focus on doing the serological test, but you can also use your milk ring test. But you can't just indefinitely for 5 or 10 years just use milk ring tests. You eventually do need to test your animals with serological tests to make sure that they are in fact negative. With the different provinces as well, what I meant with the provincialized structure, all of them sort of, they've got their own budget and their own way of dealing with diseases as prescribed by the Act. So they still need to follow the Animal Diseases Act and the regulations and the brucellosis control measures that have been laid down. It's just sometimes different provinces have got different challenges with regards to different farming types in their areas and also different wildlife challenges, for example. So there is often a difference in approach, but when it comes to the Act and the regulations, they should be consistent because they're all following the same control measures.
Okay, the next person said, not sure if I missed it, is the testing specifically RBT at the farmer's expense or sponsored by government?
Okay, yeah, it would also once again depend which province is involved. Each province gets awarded their own budget based on the budget that the province gets, based on the budget that the Department of Agriculture gets. So in some provinces, you might have a bigger budget, for example, that let's say commercial farmers can also apply for state sponsorship of testing of their herds. In other provinces, because resources need to be diverted to other diseases, you'll find that veterinary services mainly focuses on communal herds or on farmers that can't afford to pay for the test themselves. then they might only sponsor those that really can't afford it, whereas let's say commercial farmers that can put it into their business plan, would be required to pay for the test themselves. Usually what we're seeing in the country at the moment is that your commercial farmers tend to pay for their own testing, let's say RBT, whereas if you come to a communal setup, veterinary services need to pay, otherwise the test won't get done. But then once a herd is identified as infected, that goes under state veterinary control, and then ideally government should be paying for the rest of the tests that are done in an infected herd.
Okay, thank you. Earlier this week, one speaker alluded that the state has not been on the ball for the past 30 years and that Western Cape is the only province implementing the proper brucellosis control. Is this information true or false? And what is the implementation status in the 7 of 9 provinces that have functional testing laboratories that's accredited?
Okay, it's honestly, it is a very difficult question to answer. I know the Western Cape province is doing a very good job when it comes to brucellosis control. But if you then also just look at a map of the distribution of cattle farms, they do have a bit less than the other provinces have to deal with. For example, if you compare the Western Cape's cattle population to the Eastern Cape's got a lot of cattle and they've got a lot of communal herds as well. So you do just need to keep in mind, once again, each province has their own political agenda and political way of how they break down their budget. And veterinary services only gets a small proportion of the budget that's allocated to agriculture. So if agriculture doesn't get allocated a big budget in your province, veterinary services might not get allocated a big budget. So it depends on finances that's made available to the province, and it also once again depends on other disease challenges. For example, if you look at Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and KwaZulu-Natal, they've got the FMD control zone that they also need to deal with. So they've got additional control measures that they need to keep applying using their own provincial budget. So it's just not an easy question to answer, because each province has got their own prerogative on why they're spending X amount of budget on brucellosis, or why can't they spend more on brucellosis. When it comes to the 7 out of the 9 provinces with functioning labs, just because your province has got a functioning lab doesn't necessarily mean your brucellosis control is fully functioning. It just means it makes it a lot easier for you to send your samples to your lab for testing. When it comes to courier costs, etc. So the provinces that don't have functioning labs, or that can't test all the way up to CFT level or culture as well, they then just send samples to their provincial labs that are not accredited, that are then just couriered to either a neighboring province to be tested, or sent to the ARC OVR. So it doesn't mean if there's no lab, there's no testing. It just means it's a bit more difficult, or it costs a bit more to actually get the test done. Yeah, but I actually think in conclusion, there's a lot more that veterinary services can try to do when it comes to brucellosis control. That being said as well, from the private sector, there's also a lot more that can be done. And this is really a disease, if you think about it, if you're just going to rely on veterinary services to control this disease, it's not going to be enough. If you just rely on the private sector to control this disease, it's also not going to be enough. It's really going to require both the private and government sectors taking hands, moving forward and working together. In many other countries, you more and more see the situation of public-private partnerships when it comes to disease control efforts. It's just too expensive for one sector to carry on their own. So the situation in the country currently not ideal, but that's the whole point of the brucellosis policy, is to try to address that and to see how we can move forward, pool our resources together, and actually just try and get a better outcome by working together.
Okay, we still have a lot of questions, and Dr. Martin van der Leek also raised his hand, but we're running out of time. So, Dr. Martin, I'm going to ask you to continue, and then we maybe can handle one other question before we hand over to our next speaker.
All right, thanks so much. So all of you need a red telephone on your desk that goes straight to Dr. Alicia's desk. because you will certainly use this resource. What I wanted her to comment on quickly is how dependent a program like this is on animal ID.
Very good question, Martin. It's extremely dependent on animal ID. If you go back to the slides, I didn't discuss it in detail, but as part of the veterinary strategy, animal identification and traceability is one of the core aspects that the veterinary strategy needs to address. The system that we're currently working on is, let's say, the livestock identification and traceability system of South Africa, where we want to identify all cattle. And it's going to make a massive difference when it comes to disease control efforts, finding your positive animals, quarantining positive animals, and then also with movement control, because that's basically where we're losing the battle at the moment. Animals are moving without being tested. Positive animals are moving without us even knowing. So it plays a huge role in disease control.
Okay, for dairy cows testing positive, must the farmer dry them off or just milk them separately and disregard the milk till there's confirmation of the positive animal on the second serological test?
Okay, also a very good question. When it comes to the slaughtering of animals, sometimes it is just not economically possible to immediately slaughter your animals. So that's why it's important to keep them separate as far as possible. Within that scenario, you would first milk your negative animals, and all the animals that test positive, you'll milk them last. And then obviously afterwards, you're going to disinfect and clean everything. And then depending once again on what the picture is, if it's just a few animals with low titers, you might wait until the next round of testing before you decide to slaughter them. But if there's a massive amount of positive animals, you might need to start slaughtering them a bit quicker. But you can keep them and milk them last. And then either discard of the milk, or if you keep it separately and you want to boil and pasteurize it before you use it, you can do that. But it can become a bit of a logistical nightmare. But always milk those animals last, and keep them separate as far as possible to prevent spread to your other animals.
Okay, then if there's an occurrence of 2 to 3 animals out of a herd of 2,400, testing at 43, 46 on a continuous basis, what would the way forward be?
Okay, if they continuously just remain at that low titer, like I said, you need to ask yourself some other questions. Where they may be vaccinated late, or they may be infected with a different pathogen that's just cross-reacting on your test as well. If it's just a few animals that are really persistently giving you problems, sometimes it is just actually better to slaughter those animals to get rid of them so that you don't have these test positive animals in your herd. But then also, if you slaughter them, make sure that there's a veterinarian there that can collect samples from those animals when they're sent for slaughter, so that you can culture and basically see if you get any brucellosis back, or if you culture a different organism. For example, Yersinia is known for cross-reacting on brucellosis test. So if it's just a few, sometimes it is just better to get them out of your herd, but try to get to the bottom of it to determine why were they persistent reactors as well.
Okay. Thank you. Then, is it only a state vet that can do serum test, RBT, or can a private practitioner do it as well?
Private practitioner can also collect bloods and send it for RBT or CFT. This is done a lot in the dairy industry. It's just once a herd is infected and it's a positive herd, then your state veterinary services needs to come in and take over control of the herd. So if it's just your routine testing, private vets conduct the test as well, yes.
Okay, then the last question. If you tested cows for BM, do you still need a red cross from the certified if you're negative for BM?
No. If the herd is completely negative, you don't need Red Cross permits. It's just in a positive herd that's under quarantine. If you want to move animals for slaughter to the abattoir, you need to get a Red Cross permit from the state vet.
Thank you, Dr. Alicia. I think we can still continue for a long time. With your permission, can we please provide the attendees with your email address?
Yeah, sure. If anyone has got further question or anything that you're concerned about or wondering about, you're welcome to send me an email.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your willingness and all the information that you shared. Okay, thank you. And hello to your teacher as well.
Okay, have a good day.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye. Okay.